We're standing outside the RIC barracks of 1920. The front has changed somewhat. The steps leading up to the hall door would have run the length of the building, and there's another door here which is obscured from view, and the steps ran right through. After the sack and the funeral of Gibbons and Lawless, on the day of the funeral, the established RIC officers who would have been in place before the Black and Tans arrived and joined them, those guys who would have been the traditional officers who would have provided the policing service and would have been known within the community, stood here as a guard of honour as the cortege of the funeral went past. The coffins of Gibbons and Lawless on their way to their eternal resting place in Balscatton. The RIC brought enough of the community to come out and stand in tribute to the men that their colleagues had murdered the day before. That, I think, indicates quite clearly that there were two forms of RIC, the RIC and then the Black and Tans. But they were contaminated because the Black and Tans were part of the RIC, and one has to ask the question, is it not necessary to stand up on some occasions and simply say, this is unacceptable, I'm not staying in an organisation such as this, if this is the values it currently holds. Oh, that was an interesting walkabout.
Was indeed, Colin. Thanks very much.
Many of the key points of the events that happened. Of course, there was an awful lot more houses and so on. There was 50, I think, properties destroyed. Families ruined. The death of, James Lawless and John Gibbons. I suppose.
So we still have to talk about Gibbons and Lawless being picked up.
Yeah.
We'll go up in a minute and have a look at the memorial. But so what was that the next day or that night they were picked up?
That night.
Yeah, that night. I mean, sort of the event happened on the evening of the 20th, with the Tans coming in 8-9 o'clock, and the auxiliaries arriving would appear around 11 o'clock, and then overnight the town was just turned over.
Yeah. Well, Gibbons was picked up, you see. He couldn't. He was told to leave, but he couldn't leave on account of the cattle. And when he sorted things out there, he left his sister, I think, looking after the place. And he was just on the way down the stairs.
What house was this, Vincent?
It was up in Skerry Street, or in Hampton Street.
Okay.
It's gone now. What do you call it?
Is that where there's a plaque for Reynolds, the cyclist? Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Beside Forester Hall.
So that was Gibbons' house.
That was Gibbons' house. They had a dairy there and a lot of cattle. He was supposed to be leaving to go on the run, and coming down the stairs, and they broke in the door and grabbed him.
There must have been a petrol station somewhere here as well, Vincent, because they got the petrol from here and they used it for burning the.
There. You see that house there?
Yeah.
Just by that, there was a dent in the wall, and they had a petrol pump, or there was an ordinary pump there. But Canellan, that man Canellan, had a garage there, Martin Canellan.
Right.
And then they would have gone there, got the petrol and burned it.
Well, it's the only garage really close to it.
Okay. We touched on Jack Straw a couple of times on our walkabout, but he actually lived on this street as well, but he lived further back up.
Further up near
the really effectively the shopping centre was built on that property.
There were four 3-story houses there, and there was a couple of families in some.
I'll just ask. So your grandmother got up the next morning, or what happened?
No, my mother.
Your mother?
My mother. They left the house there, they were in number 3, and they went up the bower, up under the arches, and went up and stayed in the bower. The next morning she came back with one of our older brothers, because my great-grandmother wouldn't leave the house. Come back, they thought everything was going to be burned. As a matter of fact, some of the lads were like in the middle of the night and took perishable stuff and put them in bars of water and all that to keep them safe. And all that. Back through King Cllr in the back way. But that's how she happened, and of course everyone, crowds up there looking at them. The place where they were killed, like blood was up the wall, and the bodies were the far side of the road. So people were saying that they're going to put the bodies, they're going to throw them into the river. That's true or false.
Like were they put on display or dumped?
I know they were dumped there. Someone threw a sheet over them or coat over them. But John Gaynor says he was around. You see, he stayed around. He didn't go on the run. Probably didn't realise that it was going to be so serious. But he went the next day, and that's where he met Jack Straw.
You see him to approach Jack Straw the next morning, yeah?
Looking at the body.
And Jack Straw was all dishevelled and looked like he'd been up all night.
That's right.
He'd a bit of burning.
Yeah, he was laughing, and John Gaynor says, "What are you laughing at?" You know, he was dancing around laughing.
The Gaynor, I think, actually says is that he was standing looking into one of the ruined buildings, and that a gas pipe had fractured, and that
it
it
was on fire,
shooting a flame high into the air, and Straw was becoming very excited by the sight of that and animated. And I think at that stage then the word was given to Straw that he was in difficulties, that the IRA had him figured out as an agent, and that he had played a part in pointing out the houses which had been burnt and houses that IRA men might be picked up from.
Yeah. So an informer as such.
Yeah, that he was an agent.
So what he then absconded, was that directly absconded to Skerries or later on?
Well, he would appear to have made his way more or less immediately to Skerries. Most of us that talk about this find it difficult to understand that if he had felt that he was rumbled as an agent, why didn't he go and find sanctuary in the camp or so on? But he was heading in the opposite direction. But he arrived into Skerries, and the reports say that two volunteers put him out of the town. One of them certainly was Terry Sherlock. And Straw went on then out of the town and up at Corduff, interestingly, which is the location where Thomas Ashe had lived and fought. Dan Brophy, driving a bread van, saw him on the road and recognised him, but Brophy had no weapon with him and was loath to confront him. So he went off and he got himself a gun and came back and stopped and offered Straw a lift. And Straw got into the van, and Brophy then brought him around to Grey Stew, which is the road from Blake's Cross up towards Ballybocken. And that was a Sinn Féin court location, and he was tried there, and the sentence was death. Heppard, who was the information officer, the intelligence officer of the brigade, was involved, and his grandson told me only the other day in terms of what actually happened next, and it was that when he was sentenced to death, he was taken out and brought to Arnoldstown, which is the back road between Ballybocken and or Murdoch, that road, and to a farm there called Seavers, and brought down through the fields to a point where a stream starts, and it's boggy and marshy, and had some element of overflow, and he was shot there and killed. And the body was then taken and brought south into the next townland, which is called Bettyville, and they say the body was found about a half a mile off the road, back in obviously a field or two fields, again somewhere on a river stream, which is that stream actually goes and locks into, connects all together there. There's a bridge running under the road slightly further on. The body, when it was found, the autopsy reports that he had been shot through the right eyebrow, and that a bullet was found in his skull. So the court of inquiry, of course, was held, and it was duly found that he was killed by persons unknown. One of the interesting elements of the thing was the body had to be recovered. And there is a document from the RIC to the Army to say, are you guys going to pay for this out of Army funds, the recovery of Jack Straw's body? And the details of the bill are 1 bottle of whiskey, 12 shillings, 1 special cart, 3 shillings, total 15 shillings. So the bottle of whiskey was the most expensive part of recovering the body of Jack Straw. And, you know, equipped somewhere else, you know, the spirit was moved. So that really is another story. It goes into a whole new realm. There's always been great controversy about who Jack Straw was the whole name making up, was it Hemshaw, was it Henshaw, whatever. He's buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. There are 3 people in the grave with him. Presumably it was a pauper grave. And he's recorded in those records as William John Straw. And equally in the newspaper accounts, it suggested regiments that he had served in and locations. And again, I mentioned Paddy Finnegan. And he has done research and tracked it all down. The papers we have provide his actual service number and that he had served in Palestine and that he was discharged from the army ultimately after the war. So together.
We've identified that the old Balbriggan shopping centre is where that family home
that's right.
was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, the story that he was the nephew, that's what the uncle said at the court of inquiry into his death, that he was my wife's nephew. You know,
right.
So then the logic of that is that to get to Straw, you have to move. That there had to be a sister who was married to Straw. So that's we would appear to have that piece of
just on the bringing the Straw, bringing people around. I vaguely have a recollection of a tale where the Black and Tans were led by, I don't know if it was Straw or someone, up past Smith's, and they were intent on doing Smith's. But for whatever reason, somebody came out of Smith's and dissuaded them or changed their minds, and they moved on to Deeds Templar on the. Is there more to that story?
The next British Army man came out and pleaded with them. I don't know what his name was, but he was living in a house there.
Right.
Belonged to Smith's. Smith's owned 5 or 6 houses there.
Dr. Fulham's name was attached to that story.
He was involved in that. He went around with them and pleaded with them certain houses.
We haven't mentioned Dr. Fulham at all.
No, indeed, and he was a very important person, and that's quite clearly recognised by the fact that, you know, Fulham Terrace and so on.
Yeah.
That they saw fit to ensure his name continued.
I think Dr. Fulham actually, if I'm not mistaken, saved Mick Brock's life when he was shot. Forever to brought him, but Dr. Fulham looked after him. They would have left him to die.
Mick Brock shot in the foot at a further.
He shot up and way up in
the hip.
The hip and the foot up in the nose, up around what he got, the night's head.
Yeah, he was cycling along and 2 tenders arrived carrying Black and Tans, and he managed to. The first one went past him, paid no attention. The second one was just past him, and an RIC guy suddenly realised who he was.
So he would have been on the run.
Yeah,
continuously for the rest of his life.
Yes, yeah. Well, till he was shot at that point,
right.
And ultimately he then became. He wasn't fit to provide service after that shooting. But in the interval between the Sack of Balbriggan and the shooting, he certainly was very much on the road. And many of the names were simply, you know, running in fear of their life continuously, yet finding ways of being effective agents. So we now are standing on the bridge across the Bracken River in the centre of Balbriggan. We're at a plaque which was erected 21 years after the killing of these 2 men, Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons, were brutally done to death by British forces while in their custody, 20th September 1920. And that was erected 1941, as I say. Our founding members were involved in raising funds to put this plaque in place. They were involved in raising money for mainly welfare issues, but they equally recognised the need to join with the local communities in creating moments of memory. They were ensuring that the events which caused the departure of British forces from Ireland would be remembered, and the bravery and the sacrifices which people made would be there for others to see in later years. And so be this, 100 years after these men died, we still talk about them, and we talk about the moment of history here in Balbriggan, which was so important towards the final peace that was negotiated between Britain and Ireland.